Hello and welcome to Wessex Museums' first ever podcast series, Interrogating Hardy. This series we will be focusing on Thomas Hardy and if he is the unique hero we, or at least I, would like to think of him as. My name is Harriet Still and I am the Wessex Museums Hardy curator as well as being the host of this podcast. Thomas Hardy once said, "What are my books but one plea against man's inhumanity to man, to woman and to the lower animals?" This aptly named podcast series will question how far his writing did speak about multiple issues, if writing alone was enough to call him an activist, and how this can reflect our own time. Hello and welcome to the last episode of Interrogating Hardy. What a journey! Over this project, our guests and I have interrogated how groundbreaking and unique Hardy was on various subjects, from his depictions of animal welfare to his views on war. Some points have been won and others, I have to admit, have been lost, but all of them via very interesting discussions. Now we're here for our final episode to sum up, is Hardy still relevant today? Joining me to delve into this are two very extra special guests who have been working on Hardy's Wessex project right from the very beginning. We have Chloe Taylor, who is a recent graduate of Arts and Humanities with Classical Studies through the Open University, and who volunteered throughout the project, helping us with writing content, administration and condition checking and a bit of everything really. But she's now working with Portland Museum. And also we're joined by Dr Anjana Khatwa, our engagement lead for Wessex Museums. Hello and welcome both to the show.
Hi Harriet, it's nice to be here.
Hello.
First question I wanted to ask was, had either of you actually read any Hardy before you started out on this project? I'm going to first of all point the finger in Angela's direction.
Well, I didn't actually study A-level English literature or English, even though my English teacher was deeply disappointed. So I never read Hardy at school or even later in life. It was only when I began working at Wessex Museums that I thought I'd better get to know the man a little bit more in his works. And my first novel that I actually tackled was Mayor of Casterbridge, because that's what everybody recommended.
And Chloe, come on, own up.
I had never read any of his work, but I vaguely remember going to see his cottage on a school trip. We went to Thorncombe Woods and had a little explore as a little child. But yeah, I only really knew of him, not his work. Growing up in Dorset, he's just there.
When you did finally delve into him, both of you, what were your first impressions?
I loved it. I loved the novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. I thought it was filled with humour and irony, and I thought it was an incredibly relevant novel for today. So I was genuinely surprised by how much I enjoyed it, because I'd heard all of these stories about his books being quite difficult reads, quite emotionally traumatic, and The Mayor of Casterbridge has that, but actually I was surprised by how sharp the wit and the humour was.
And Chloe, what was your first dip into Hardy when you did actually take the dive?
The first book I read was Tess of the D'Urberville. It wasn't a hard read, the subjects were hard, but I really enjoyed his way of writing, his way of describing the landscapes and things. I thought it was beautiful. But I was really not fell for him, but who he was as a person, his beliefs. I was like, yeah, I dig it, yeah.
Do you think that was just by reading the booklet that interest in him sparked, or was it the project itself?
I definitely feel getting to know Hardy through the exhibit was a brilliant way to get to know him biographically. Both his writing and who he was as a person, I kind of fell into his world.
Was there any kind of big turning moment, eyes meeting across the room moment for you and Hardy, or was it just a gradual, slow burning love?
It was finding out his background, finding out he grew up from a working class family. I was just like, okay, I see the world that he's trying to create from the world that he was brought up in.
Anjana, passing back over to you, do you think there was anything with the project that gave you suddenly a new perspective, or actually did you just get to know him and think, oh, I'm going to try and ignore the man and just focus back on the book?
I think I started with The Good Book of his. I think it's a novel which touches on some really critical modern day issues which relate to women and their autonomy and their right to live as within their own power, if you like, because in the book, spoiler alert, if you don't know it, the mayor or the future mayor of Casterbridge sells his wife and child to the highest bidder. So when I read that book, it really made me think about modern contemporary issues, about the way women are viewed in today's society. And then as the story progresses, there are these twists and turns, and to me it felt like an episode of EastEnders. It just felt surprising at every aspect, and I think I'm one of those rare creatures maybe who hasn't read the story, hasn't had it spoilt for them. So it was a page turner, because every time I saw a twist and a turn in the relationships between the characters in the book, for me it was a delightful surprise. And when I think of him now, because then later I went on to read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which was a far darker experience, I started to really see him in a different way, that he's a man of different voices and different abilities, very different to someone like Jane Austen. When you look at Austen's catalogue of work, you kind of know what to expect. You know the issues she's going to talk about and the landscape that she paints for you. With Hardy, when you go from a novel like Mayor of Casterbridge to Tess of the D'Urbervilles, there is that central theme of women and grievances against women that appear in both novels, but the tone and the settings are very different, and they feel very different. And so for me, those two novels that I did read, they showed me his flex, really, his muscle as a writer to touch on different issues, but in some cases with the brevity in the prose, which another novel dealt with very differently.
I always think that with Mayor of Casterbridge, there's a real sense of the community coming into play, and the community being like a character in itself. Whereas Tess of the D'Urbervilles, it's so focused on that one person's experience and how they view the world. And it's such a traumatic experience that she goes through that reading it can be quite a grueling process.
Yeah, there's an intensity to that novel, which I had heard about it, so I knew of the story of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but I probably didn't expect the intensity of immersing myself into that story as much as Mayor of Casterbridge, and that's what surprised me, was the intense emotions and upset that I felt.
One of the things I find interesting working with Hardy is there's very much that approach of, he's just very, very miserable. Do you think there's a purpose to his misery, having read it, or do you think it is just misery when you read something like Tess?
I think misery breeds feelings of empathy and sensitivity in the reader, so you actually really begin to deeply care for the characters that he's wanting you to feel passion and empathy for. So in a way, through painting these pictures of despair and the distraught circumstances in which his characters find themselves in, you as a reader really deeply begin to care, and you are involved in their lives in ways that you didn't expect. These are characters that lived 150 years ago in a society that's very different to the one that we live in now. But through that process, I think you explore your own emotions about how you can grow as a person in terms of your own empathy and sensitivity to those issues. So there is a reason behind it. I'm not sure if that's what he wanted the reader to feel, but that's certainly how I ended up feeling.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, that what does the reader impose on the book versus what does the author intend? And can a book be valid because of what the reader interprets, regardless of what the author's intention is? I think I always come down on if it gives you a meaning yourself and something you can take away from it, then that is the most important thing. But passing back to Chloe, I was just wondering, you said that Tess of the D'Urbervilles was your first book. What did you make of that, if you were jumping into that?
It was a hard one. It's a book with a lot of trauma, shall we say. But what I felt at the time I read it, and I was only thinking of how contemporary readers would have thought of it. But then once I sat back and thought about what it was showing how women could only really make changes through something drastic. Again, with the spoilers, at the end she tragically murdered. And I don't know, I don't know if that's what Thomas Hardy was trying to show, that women had no out back then. It was a very deep read.
It was interesting. I was having a chat with Edwina Grosvenor for her podcast the other day, and we were saying it's interesting because you go into Tess of the D'Urbervilles and you think it's very dark and you think it's very of its time, and how could a woman be put in that situation today? And then she was saying, but there are so many women today who get in these abusive relationships where you do feel trapped, and even though you think in today's modern age you shouldn't be, the psychological effects of being in a single house with one person who's imposing those opinions on you and kind of effectively trapping you through financial or emotional or whatever, that's something that is still a massive issue. And that was really powerful for me, having read the book and then thinking hopefully that would never happen today, and then just having that reality shock out of my nice fluffy bubble, thinking no, actually this is still a massive issue. And I think, Chloe, you were saying as well about Jude the Obscure, because you read that, which is I think probably like the heavyweight of Thomas Hardy reading. What did you make of that?
I say I read it, I had to stop reading it because
oh, Chloe,
it really broke me. Jude, he loves classical history, and he's put in so much effort into wanting to start an education. I can't remember quite rightly in the story who he wrote to. Was it a professor or a dean he wrote asking for advice? I want to start an education, can you help me? And he got a reply just saying, just give up, really. There's no point. I distinctly remember that. I was in a coffee shop and I was tearing up, but I closed the book, I put it in my bag. It kind of touched a feeling inside of me because I've been caring for my mum and I always wanted a university education. I wanted to get a degree in history. I never thought it was possible until I researched and found the Open University. But to feel like people out there, they don't have options like this yet, and all this emotion just came over me.
But you've got your degree.
Yeah, I do.
You succeeded. You pushed back against the Philipsons of this world.
It's still quite relevant though, because people from working class backgrounds, you've still got to fight to be taken seriously in whatever field you're in.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one about that pain you can feel to see your own experience reflected in literature. And is that a good thing? Generally, would you recommend it to someone else and say, yeah, go and read Jude, it's an amazing, rousing piece and is really about real life and real people? Or would you say, don't go near it with a barge pole, it'll make you cry in a coffee shop?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would warn people. It's a very real book. It gets dark. But I am glad I read it. It made me feel grateful that I grew up in the time that I did. But yeah, I no offence, Thomas Hardy, I don't think I would recommend it.
I think that Jude is, like I said, the Thomas Hardy heavyweight. We read it when I was working at Hardy's Cottage as a group of volunteers, and it's the one that we, for some reason, had to postpone the meeting afterwards. And we all went through all this trauma together, but not able to talk about it for another 2 weeks. So when we finally saw each other, it was this moment of relief that we could finally share this horrific thing that we'd read together. But I think it is interesting, and especially because the world has changed so much, university education has opened up. And yet, like you say, it's still, again, a reality for so many. I think maybe as the world of university education opens up so much more, we forget that there are still so many glass ceilings, and having a book like this still relate to people today, it reminds you that those glass ceilings are still very much in place. But the other thing I wanted to go to was, on the other end of the scale, we've got things like Far From the Madding Crowd and Under the Greenwood Tree. And do you think there is a sense that Hardy can also provide a rural escapism?
I think there is an element of rural escapism in there, particularly when you read the early parts of Tess where she's in the dances and reading about these groups of young people that are walking over the hills of Dorset, and Far From the Madding Crowd where before that horrendous accident happens with the sheep falling off the cliff. There is that sense of being at one with the landscape and working the land and reaping the benefits from it. I would imagine at that time living in the cities was rather horrendous. It was polluted, it was difficult. There were workhouses. Anyone from children to pregnant women would be working all hours of the day. So reading a novel like that where you can almost breathe the clean air, you can see the sparkling water of the sea, it gives you that sense of freshness and cleanliness that perhaps the readers were looking for. I mean, just like any literature today or any TV program, people are watching Escape to the Country for that very reason, aren't they? They are looking for that dream, that idyllic dream of, I'd love to go across the other side of the fence and live that life. And I think some of Thomas Hardy's novels are literally the escape to the country for the Victorian clientele, aren't they? They paint this beautiful image of rural Britain. And I think he probably did a very brave thing in painting a different picture of rural Britain by talking about hardship and poverty and social inequity. And I think you kind of enter into his world with an assumption of it is all going to be shepherds and farmers and beautiful fields and everybody having a jolly old time. And then it really does hit you about how hard life is for a certain sector of society. And you do see that come out in his novels. It's kind of Escape to the Country does meet EastEnders or something like that, isn't it? It's
more true of human life and human experience. I think one thing that he does quite well is that way of blending in that living in these places, yes, it can be incredibly beautiful on a sunny day with the sheep bleating and everything. But then the flip side of that is that there's going to be the middle of winter when there's thick ice on all of the troughs and you're having to break it just to get enough water for the animals to drink, and the mud and the tiredness and the coldness that must have been endured by these people. But I think it's interesting about like what value does that escapism have in and of itself? Like, is it actually valuable, or is it almost kind of running away from reality in between all the nasty things? And I think, like you say, because he tempers it with that harsh reality, it kind of balances itself out. Have you got any thoughts, Chloe?
Well, I was going to say, working at Portland Museum, I've been gradually reading through The Well-Beloved, set on the Isle of Slingers. And looking out my window is like I can see it. So I do appreciate the breaks where he can describe the landscape and you can just be like, oh, this is nice. But like you guys said, he does blend it well. The city scenes are rough. So can the agricultural bits be. But yeah, like I said, when you look out your doorstep and you can see what he's describing, it is a beautiful feeling.
Do you think that adds something for you, knowing what he's describing so intimately before reading it? Or does it end up being a bit like watching a film adaptation of a book you know really well and you're like, oh, it's all just slightly wrong?
Well, it depends, especially with The Well-Beloved. It's a hefty read, but it is weird. It's like he wrote this book however long ago, but it's still here.
Yeah, because the quarry landscape there is just so unavoidable, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it that book he talks about when the Chesil Bank got washed through by a massive storm? I don't think I'd come across that before I read that.
Yeah, so like the floods down at Chesil, it happens every so often, and it is weird hearing it being described. As I said, it's I know about that.
And so I suppose, like, widening this out now, having talked about what relationship you personally have with Hardy, do you think Hardy has anything wider to say to a modern, diverse, contemporary audience? Or do you think that he has had his day and he might speak personally to those of us who get thrown in his path, but actually that's it?
He's one of these authors that does translate really well to contemporary narratives, and I think particularly to diverse voices. I mean, you look at some of Jane Austen's novels, particularly Pride and Prejudice, which has been adapted into various formats, but particularly Gurinder Chadha, who adapted it in a very much a Bollywood style, because Jane Austen's narratives on women and how they're able to rise through society due to marriage, making good marriages, is a very central tenet of South Asian society. A good marriage makes a good woman. And when I have a think about the narratives that Hardy talks about, if we look at The Mayor of Casterbridge about modern day slavery, about women treated as objects, as possessions, and literally just discarded on a whim. This man was drunk when he sold his wife and child. And we think about how people are trafficked, how people are moved from place to place, then those narratives are very real and very contemporary, particularly for refugees and for asylum seekers. We saw that with Mo Farah recently in the documentary on the BBC, how he was trafficked to Britain as a very young child. So I think for a lot of diverse audiences, there are narratives there that hit home in a very difficult way. And more broader, when we think about the world that Hardy's created, particularly this world of agriculture and farming and labour, and we look at some of the issues that are happening across the world, particularly in the Indian subcontinent. About 18 months ago, there were a huge group of farmers in the Punjab that went on strike because the government was trying to force through huge legislative changes that would have impacted upon their way of life. So moving away from small farming communities, smallholds, everything operated at a very much a community grassroots level, and moving more towards government controlled large corporate structures. The farmers went on strike, and they were on strike for hundreds of days, and it was terrible for them. And so you can see in some of Hardy's writings where he's writing about the life and the times of people working in agriculture 150 years ago, fighting against a system. Mechanisation, for example, I mean, that comes out really strongly, doesn't it, in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, about the impact of mechanisation on farming communities. And this is what was happening in India, in the Punjab 18 months ago. This is what the farmers were striking against the government, against mass mechanisation. So I think a lot of those issues very much resonate with different audiences across the world. I think probably the reason why it doesn't have a harder hit is principally because Hardy has that image problem. You know, he's an old white Victorian man. So how does he relate to a farmer from the Punjab in 2021 who's on strike? And I think if you have the time and the energy to delve a bit deeper, or someone is able to interpret and translate that for you, then his messages and his narratives about workers' rights and about the value on grassroots movement really resonates strongly.
Thank you. I hadn't heard about the Punjab farmers, but it's got so much relevance to what was happening here with the swing riots and Tolpuddle martyrs and just that really difficult part of history that Hardy was directly influenced by. And yeah, Chloe, what do you feel, having grown up in Dorset and only coming to Hardy later? Do you think that having now got into him, he has something to say for a modern audience, or do you think that it's just unusual that you've been thrown in his way?
There is a bit of an image problem, him being a white man. We've heard a lot from the white man throughout history, and I'm guilty of not looking further into him throughout my whole life. I've just seen him as, oh, he's a white Victorian author, yeah, okay. But reading into his stuff, his beliefs, I was shocked, and I do feel like he has something to say. There's also so many other people that have things to say and need representation.
And I think it's really interesting, your point about that. I was at this conversation with an author, actually Alexander McCall Smith, and I went to an event for Sidmouth Literary Festival a few years ago. And one of the questions from the audience, how do you write the #1 ladies detective agency? Here you've got a character who's a traditionally built Botswanan woman. How do you write her character? And his response was very fair. He's like, well, I'm an author. That's what authors do. They write about people or about situations, and sometimes those situations aren't relevant to who they are. And I think Hardy's writing and his ability to stretch his literary muscle to write about situations and people that don't necessarily reflect who he is a real skill. But I think there is also value in celebrating authors who are writing from those lived experiences of what it is like to be a black woman. So Maya Angelou in particular. I think there is space for those voices as long as they are not speaking and clouding over the genuine, authentic voices that are speaking to that experience. But I think at that time, who was being published? It was mostly men, and women's voices were very much, if you wanted a book published, at that time, his voice was being published, and he had the opportunity to platform the experiences of women and those of the working class. But now we live in a society where publishing is moving towards a space which is recognizing the lack of diversity within the sector itself. And I think if people like Thomas Hardy can move over because they've had their time and it is almost like, is this a time now to showcase those voices who Hardy was speaking for?
If you're looking at it over the past episodes we've looked at the various ways that Hardy was exploring those issues in his own life, and you can see it as actually, instead of it being just a squashing, it's part of the continuum. He was self-aware of the fact that he was trying to promote these voices that he felt were underrepresented at the time, and this is the natural continuation of where that conversation has led. And I think in this recent thing about Hardy being removed from the GCSE syllabus, and of course there's only a finite number, I studied English literature at university, and I've been working with Hardy ever since. And still, I know there are huge swathes of English literature, right? I recently rediscovered Anglo-Saxon poetry and was like, I didn't even know we had stuff this old. And so there are huge swathes that we don't touch on. And that counts for modern and ancient sources. And so really, there is always going to be stuff that needs to be cut out and stuff that is going to be replacing it. We need to have that turnover right through, in the same way as I think there's quite a movement when I was at uni to try and bring in more female authors who were underrepresented in, say, Renaissance literature. So it's all part of this great churning. I'd quite like Hardy to still be known. I wouldn't like him to go into complete obscurity like Thomas Carlyle or someone.
Yeah, I've not heard of Thomas Carlyle.
No, he was big in the day, but he's had his day. I think that'd be sad if Hardy did disappear entirely, because I think that he has got such a local relevance. And like you say, he does have those stories and those characters that transcend time. But I think what we were saying just before the show, Anjana, was it's choosing whether you're keeping Hardy because you feel his stories are particularly relevant and you feel his literature is particularly stylish and eloquent, or are you just keeping him because he's a monolith and he represents something that is not actually what you get when you delve into his books? And I think that's almost where we started the conversation of, what did you first think Hardy was before you delved into him? And I think sometimes people want that kind of monolithic Hardy that they're trying to preserve.
I think the kind of the movement and the diversification of literature that young people study at school is a really interesting one, because I think it is very important that the curriculum shifts and changes to reflect the change in our society. So where in the past writers of colour have really struggled to have their voices heard, we're now entering a space where there is now an importance for those voices to be heard, rather than writers writing for them for their voices to be heard in that way. And I think Hardy will always have a place. I think his stories are incredibly relevant, particularly in terms of contemporary issues associated with women and the working class, and like we talked about, agricultural labour. But I think there is also an opportunity for young people to engage in literature that speaks to them and resonates with them, because I think at the end of the day, it's more important we help young people develop a love for literature and a love for reading so that they are inspired to explore further outside of their sphere of influence. And I think many writers are inspired by Hardy. It's a breadcrumb trail, isn't it? You read a novel, for example, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, or you could read another novel by Rohinton Mistry, A Fine Balance, which is also about the working class in India. And from then you spring on to other things. And I think that's how we should view Hardy. You know, he's part of this trail of breadcrumbs where contemporary authors writing about issues that are related to his passions and his interests, they will find him.
School syllabus is never going to be perfect, and like you guys were saying, if you look outside of what you were learning at school, you will find Hardy. Growing up as a confused, closeted queer person, to have heard LGBTQ plus stories or poetry at school, I feel like wholeheartedly it would have helped me. So I am glad that the future children are being taught these stories.
No, I think that's really important. And I think Hardy really did have something to say for his day. And I think what he covered in those topics and speaking for those voices at that point couldn't be heard on a world stage, I think was incredible. And I think, like we said, for those who want to delve into him, he still has so much to say. But he really does need to be viewed alongside a wider pantheon of writers. He can't just be held as this monolithic, mustachioed gentleman of Wessex for the rest of forever. And what we're looking for now is we need some more Wessex voices to come through and to get that kind of diversity in the Wessex landscape so that we have that writer that we can then look back to another 150 years.
He really was brave for standing up for his beliefs in those days, though. I remember doing the condition assessments at the History Centre, and I can't remember exactly who he was writing to, but he was writing against the slaughtering of animals. I remember thinking, gosh, he must have really annoyed the people that loved a good fox hunt on the weekends. But I don't think that mattered to him, whereas he could have easily just not spoken up about these things and probably become more successful that way.
I do have huge admiration for what he did and how he writes. And I think what really occurred to me when I was reading Mayor of Casterbridge for the first time, which is probably why I then recommended it to Anjana, was just that sense of really real people, and the emotions they were going through just felt so real. It didn't just feel like stereotyped tropes. The reasons why people did things and the kind of motives and the way it all followed through just felt so real and resonant for me.
That hopelessness in Jude the Obscure, it hit. It really sucked the joy. I know that's not a positive thing to say. Read Thomas Hardy. The way he can portray feelings is on point. He was good at that.
Well, and I think that's another interesting thing with the Warwick University trigger warning, which I was thinking when it came out was like, literature shouldn't always be easy. It shouldn't be something that we can read without being offended. Quite a lot of really good literature actually is slightly offensive in that it stirs up our thoughts and makes us think and criticize the world we're in. And so much as it's, I think it's important to have trigger warnings for things that might upset people. So because, I've got particular issues that I know if I read would really get to me probably more than the average person. But at the same time, I think that it's really important to accept that really good literature probably will always challenge us. And that's what Hardy does.
Yeah, I agree. And I think almost like you can view novels written 100 or 150 years ago and think, well, time has passed and there's a dilution of the impact that those stories have because they were written so long ago. But I think it's really important to view the fact that what is happening today, for example, violence against women or the way the working classes are viewed, are as relevant now as they were in his day. And so the emotional impact and the trauma of those narratives and those discourses that he discusses in his novels are still very much impactful on people if they have had those lived experiences. I certainly read some of the responses in the press, the snowflakes, and you do read those accusations, are young people far too sensitive for their own good? Well, no, actually, they're human beings, and there is a level of humanity of recognizing whatever novel it is, however long ago it was written, the impact that can have on a person, because you cannot underestimate even a word or a sentence or a whole narrative within the book, that impact that can have on an individual. So I think the trigger warnings are sensible, actually.
I agree. We've all lived different lives. We've all had unique experiences, and whether it's mental health or PTSD or anything, it's nothing to be made fun of or creating a stigma by calling it woke or whatever. I've heard that word a lot. I agree. I think trigger warnings are exactly that. It's a warning. People are allowed to make choices these days.
So do we think that Hardy still has a relevance? And if so, what is his role? Or do we feel that he needs to, in a very abrupt way, kind of move aside?
I think Hardy has enormous relevance today, but I think there needs to be a better job of perhaps marketing him as contemporary and relevant, particularly to young people, because that is where his name and his work will survive. We already know that there's a huge readership out there of a certain age and a certain demographic, but in order to ensure his continuing legacy, we have to help to translate some of the messages in his novels so that they are relevant and meaningful and resonate with new audiences. And by new audiences, I do mean young people, but I also mean Black and Asian audiences as well, who would have previously looked at him as an old white Victorian man. And there are narratives in his books which are incredibly relevant and I think would resonate with those audiences if the stories can be translated in a way that is meaningful and not tokenistic, if you like, not trying too hard.
I do feel like he's still relevant to Dorset. As I said, he's, you look out your window and if you live in Dorset, he's there. He's permeated in every landscape. But there's so many stories to tell. And if we can modernise him in some way, I feel like the younger generation would understand what he's trying to say. But yeah, the world is moving on. I guess he can come along with us if we tried.
So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and for all your reflections on Hardy. And I know this has been not just the moment of an hour reflection on Hardy, but this has been months and months and months of working alongside him. So I really appreciate it. And I think in this one, we're going to have to say to Hardy, he just needs to work a bit harder if he wants to stay on the board. But yeah, I think, and I hope that's something that we have done with this podcast series for all those listeners who have stuck with us through the entire series, is just showing you some of the relevances of Hardy to modern life, but at the same time giving you the chance to see through that door and decide if you'd actually like to go and pick up another book, and if something else will help you understand different parts of humanity that Hardy no longer can give us the key to. But one way or another, I think we've said Hardy has still touched us all in various ways and had that relevance to us, and hopefully he will continue to have relevance for others. Thanks for listening to this episode of Interrogating Hardy. Special thanks go out to our sponsors, Batten Solicitors, as well as our funders, Arts Council for England and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Make sure to subscribe here.